Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 12th installment of the NERPS webinar series on peace and sustainability in the context of global change. My name is Dalia Simangan, and I will be your moderator for today. The theme of today's webinar is Democratizing Science and Research to Address Environmental Conflict, a journey between research and practice. And we're going to hear from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Richard Friend, about the forces that drive patterns of environmental change and the politics of knowledge surrounding efforts to address environmental conflict. But before that, I'd like to invite our NERPS director, Professor Shinji Kaneko, for his welcome remarks.
Hi, good morning, the colleagues in UK, and good evening in Japan and Asia, and then hi to the rest of the world. Thank you for joining our NERPS webinar series that we are focusing on the relationship between peace and sustainability in the context of global environment change. For those of you joining us for the first time today, as we see this nexus between peace and sustainability is a relatively new area for us to do research and also practical implementation. We decided to offer this NERPS webinar to serve as a platform for a dialogue, to invite the leading expert and to share their knowledge and experiences while bridging various stakeholders in society, typically between academia and practitioners and decision makers and citizens. As we have achieved already today a 12th webinar series talk. Since we started last year, September, less than 1 year, achieve it more than once a month frequency. So I'm very glad to have this 12 webinar series talk today. And also with this success, as we have already informed and announced in the previous webinars, we decided to have first NERPS conference in Japan, in Hiroshima, in March 2022. And it is also then a great pleasure for us to announce you that our website of the NERPS conference for the registration has opened up today and on our NERPS website. The overall objective for this NERPS conference is to provide an opportunity to physically interact among our, the colleagues and networks which has been developed for the last years throughout this webinar series, and then come over to Hiroshima to further our discussions and establish the new collaborative partnership. So in this regard, the conference overall objective is to facilitate the further transdisciplinary dialogue and collaboration between the various stakeholders. And so that's why topic of the webinar today is particularly relevant and timely. And I hope it will be a starting point for more discussion and knowledge sharing on how science and policy can work together toward more peaceful and sustainable world. So I very much appreciate Professor Richard Friend for giving us to have this learning opportunity on this new and timely topic. And I really hope we have a great time and discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kaneko Sensei. I already shared the link of the conference website, so please consider visiting that. Some housekeeping reminders before we move on with today's presentation. And as noted in the registration, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared through our website and social media accounts. For our attendees, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box or in the Q&A during the webinar. And if you want to ask question yourself, please use the raise hand function and I will enable your microphone so you can speak directly to the webinar and ask your question. I'm very much looking forward to all your questions and comments. I'm sure there will be several because I, for one, as a researcher, finds it sometimes challenging how to translate the relevance of my research into practice. But to help us navigate through these challenges as well as opportunities is Dr. Richard Friend. He's an associate professor in human geography and environment at the University of York in the UK, as well as the university's research champion for risk, evidence, and decision making. He has an academic background in social anthropology and development studies and a career as a practitioner in international development for 20 years. What a fitting combination of experience for this webinar on research and practice. Friends and colleagues, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Richard Friend.
Thanks very much for the very kind introduction and for inviting me today. As you've heard, I've spent most of my career working in international development practice after completing a PhD many years ago, and then moved back into academia 5 years ago. So this is an opportunity to reflect on some of the challenges I faced in this career and to think about what it might mean as we move forward and try and shape and influence the world in which we live. So what I will do, and I'm going to go quite quickly through some of this material and really just to flag some discussion points. I'm not necessarily going to come up with clear answers, but as I say, maybe some things for us to think about and to discuss. I'll talk about two areas of work that I've been involved in, both as a practitioner and a researcher. So looking at hydropower development in the Mekong region in Southeast Asia, looking at some of the issues around urban expansion and associated patterns of vulnerability and risk, and then really to ask some questions about the role of science and research and knowledge in addressing these kinds of challenges. And to do that, I'll just flag a couple or three projects that I've been involved in, not really to, not as an advertisement for the projects, but really to flag some different ideas of how to engage. And this has these kind of questions of particular relevance for my university as we go through a new period of strategizing and really reaffirming our original commitment to be a university for the public good. So these questions of what is the role of science and research, the social benefits of science and research, and what's the role of academia are really very much at the forefront of our minds at the moment. And just to flag a number of different research centers that we have that bring together colleagues across disciplines, looking at global development, human rights, and sustainability. Okay. So, as I say, I've been involved in international development for a long time and working really to try and shift the way that policy thinks about environmental problems and to try and influence policy and practice. And much of the core engagement strategy, if you like, has been around a model of science to policy that essentially hinges on science conducting research, generating evidence, generating insights, and communicating or disseminating that scientific evidence to policymakers with the belief, the assumption that policy will then be made on the basis of sound scientific evidence. So there's a core sort of approach to influencing policy that is generally and widely applied. And I just want to use this session to sort of unpack some of that.
What I've worked in most is sort of...
Sorry, right. So let's go into looking at the case of hydropower development in the Mekong region. And you'll see two maps there from the Stimson Center. The one on the left will give you the hydropower development that is planned on the mainstream. Well, some of it's already implemented, some of it's planned on the mainstream of the Mekong. And on the right, you will see a whole series of hydropower developments on the tributaries of the Mekong. And there's been an effort for really over 20 years, maybe 25 years now, to consider what the implications of hydropower development might be for the region, particularly the impacts on fisheries. Okay. And in many ways, what we know about the impacts of hydropower on fisheries are very well known and are fairly obvious, that hydropower projects block rivers. That's that's how they function, and they block migration routes, and they block flows of sediment. So they interrupt the natural hydrology and the natural ecology, and they therefore have impacts on fisheries, and this is well documented around the world. And we know also in the Mekong region in particular that fisheries are a hugely important source of, constituent of rural livelihoods and source of animal protein in people's diets, particularly for poorer people. And this, numbers of people that we're talking about are 45, 60 million people. So we know that fisheries are important. We know that hydropower has an impact on fisheries, and that the impacts are likely to be felt most acutely by poorer people. And over the last 20 plus years, there's been this huge generation of scientific evidence about these impacts, the scale and the severity of these impacts. And most recently, we've got a series of studies, some of which have been supported by the Mekong River Commission, which is the intergovernmental organization that brings the states of the lower Mekong, of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam together. So they've also conducted their own assessments of hydropower, and all the evidence suggests very significant losses. So a study commissioned by the MRC in 2017 talks about a 40 to 50% loss of production in Cambodia and Vietnam. This is an enormous loss of one of the most important, most biodiverse, economically significant inland fisheries in the world, in a part of the world where we still have very high rates of poor nutrition, despite rates of economic growth. And that, the potential impacts, particularly given this context and growing populations and pressure on food systems and climate change, is really very significant in nutritional terms. And the distribution of these impacts is also very significant. So we've got this evidence. It's very, very convincing and scientific evidence. And yet there's no shift. There's no shift in hydropower development. In fact, it's accelerating despite the evidence. So this whole effort of 20 plus years that we would somehow influence this hydropower agenda by generating good scientific evidence has not really been borne out. So we have all these competing policy agendas, different interests and values. So we know, that politics underpins big investments, and particularly at a regional level, in large public infrastructure. But we've not been able to shift that agenda. And despite this evidence, we see these sort of continuing discourse and narratives that, well, yes, what's interesting is there's been no denial that hydropower impacts fisheries, but it's been sort of massaged in a way that somehow these impacts are unavoidable, unfortunate, but necessary, and a sacrifice for the greater good. And there's also a sort of a notion, I think, underpinning this whole development, that there's a narrative that somehow small-scale fisheries and small-scale farmers, so we see a similar issue related to small-scale farmers, are part of the problem. They're an obstacle to development, and that really economic development for the region requires a shift, an economic transition from agrarian societies in moving people into industry and into manufacturing. So while the evidence has been very strong, the overall narrative, the overall development narrative hasn't really shifted very much.
And so one of the things...
Sorry, I'm not sure why that happened. So one of the ways in which colleagues, and this started with colleagues in Thailand, have tried to shift this debate, and this predates the development of hydropower, the investment in hydropower, and back to one of the early controversial dams in the region, the Pak Moon Dam in northeast Thailand, is that the problem isn't just a matter of evidence, of scientific evidence. It's a problem, it's a public problem, it's a public policy problem, it's a societal problem. And that the knowledge around fisheries is ignored because the fishes themselves are ignored. And that if we look at the science as generating evidence, we also need to think about a public process that allows, that supports fishers themselves to generate their own evidence, to present their own arguments, and to create the space for them to do so. So there's really what I think is a very significant effort by Thai colleagues, academic colleagues, and civil society that dates back to the Pak Moon Gap, where they've supported local people to conduct their own research, set their own research agendas. Universities, civil society provide this sort of technical support, administrative and field support to villagers to conduct their own research. But the research agenda is set by villagers, they do it themselves, they present it themselves, and they build their own networks. So this has been going on for 20 plus years. It's spread across Thailand. It involved colleagues, rural people in northeast Cambodia as well, and the villagers themselves becoming trainers of other villages in other parts of the region. So I think it's a very significant model of how research can engage, and I'm not taking any credit for this. This is work that was initiated by Thai colleagues about 20 years ago, and is continuing. So that's just one example, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay.
And so,
whoops, sorry, there's a background tape going on. So I want to just to sort of move on to another example, because we know obviously that, you know, big investment, it's shaped by all kinds of political agendas. That's nothing new, but I think there's another angle that we also need to think about. If anybody has flown to Bangkok, you're most likely to have landed at Cobra Swamp. It's probably better known now as Suvarnabhumi International Airport, but for many years it was known as Cobra Swamp. You can guess why. And Suvarnabhumi International Airport is located in a easily identified wetland, much of which is below sea level or at very low elevation, and its natural productivity has been due to the pattern of flooding and recession, this natural pattern of flooding and recession. But of course, it's an area that you would imagine would be very high risk to flooding, and not an area that one would expect large public investment in infrastructure such as an international airport. But it was targeted, and it is constructed, and it is operating. And it does so in ways that go against not just the sort of the obvious knowledge of the risks, but against land use planning processes themselves. I'm sorry, I only have this in black and white, so it's not very clear, but this is the dark black area here is Suvarnabhumi International Airport. And this is an earlier land use plan map that points out that this area, this sort of this area around here on the east of Bangkok, is an important part of the natural drainage and is really important for the security, the flood security of Bangkok itself. And that this area here in the stripy bit was designated as a floodway, as a protected area. And much of what you see in the expansion of industry and housing estates in the upper part, in this part of going up here, in the Chao Phraya Basin, was against early land use plans that tried to protect this area for agricultural reasons, but also as floodways to allow floodwaters to drain effectively around Bangkok and into the Gulf. So the construction of the airport itself went against the the sort of the obvious knowledge, but also went against some knowledge within planning documents in certain government agencies. Now, I'm sorry, this is a very poor quality map. This is the best one that I could find, but it demonstrates that in the floods of 2011, and so here you have October and here you have November, that Suvarnabhumi really lies right in the path of the floodways, of the floodwaters, and that the desperate attempts to protect infrastructure like Suvarnabhumi meant that floodwater then had to be diverted elsewhere. And so that the costs, the impacts, the vulnerabilities were shifted from Suvarnabhumi and other areas to be protected onto other peoples. And again, working against sort of natural flow, natural ecology. And when this is actually something that's this kind of investment in high risk areas is something that we see across Southeast Asia. And I would be interested to hear from colleagues whether there's something similar going on elsewhere. But through my work around urban resilience in secondary cities, it was really clear that high risk areas actually attract capital. There's something in the nature of high-risk areas, high-risk locations, that are incentives for investment in capital. And so with a colleague, Dr. Kanin at the King Mongkut Institute of Technology at Lakrabang, we produced a paper published earlier this year that really explored that this is you can see this as a function of a clash of between the internal logic of capital accumulation and the flow of water. That it makes sense, particularly in a world of crises of capital, for capital to invest in areas that are high risk, and that there's a series of refashionings of the natural landscape that allow for greater accumulation, and that the risk of flood becomes sort of internalized, both internalized and then distributed. So that, for example, the first round of investment in low-lying, flood-prone land is in filling the land, and then in building on top of the land and building the airport. And what was really interesting was that during the flood, that the protecting infrastructure then becomes another opportunity for capital accumulation. And so we get locked into this pattern of the sort of path dependency where we're invested in high-risk areas and we then invest more and more to protect those areas, all the while shifting vulnerabilities and risks on other locations. And one of the points I wanted to highlight from this sort of way of thinking about public infrastructure and the high-risk areas is that we're not going to shift this pattern of refashioning of landscapes and refashioning of land by knowledge alone. It's not that there isn't enough awareness of flood risks that is the cause of why we see investment in these areas. These risks are fully known. And as I say, actually act as an incentive for investment rather than as an impediment. Okay, so between these two cases, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of some of the work that I've been involved in that really brought home to us the sort of the tensions around and the obstacles to develop for research, for evidence, for knowledge in shifting these patterns of investment, is sort of the way we think about how the world is being shaped, the sort of the discourse and narratives as well as the practice, and to really sort of reflect on what the role of knowledge might be. So I just want to give very quickly, I want to give you a couple of examples of some research projects that I'm involved in that have tried to apply this way of thinking, just to give you a sense of what we might be doing. Not, as I say, I'm not trying to advertise or promote these research projects, but just to give you some examples. So the first draws on that Taiban Research, and it's been a collaboration between colleagues in the Mekong region, particularly Thailand and Vietnam, and colleagues working in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, and looking at the challenges around transboundary water governance, which historically has largely looked at water quantity, access and distribution, but increasingly needs to look at issues of water quality. So it's not just a problem of water quantity, but increasingly, particularly in degraded environments and with greater competition and conflict over water, issues of water quality. And this was a process of bringing colleagues together, visiting each other's work, and trying to identify, despite the different political contexts, some similarities, but major differences as well, to try and identify some key areas of working and how science and research can engage. And it was really, we came up with an approach that is really structured around sort of two-pronged attack. One, which is grounded in small-scale disruptive technologies. So you see an example of the kind of technologies of using grey water for agricultural purposes in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, so that farmers who don't have access to water infrastructure, sort of these are off-grid communities for political reasons. This is a function of the conflict. But this was an attempt between, you see there, Palestinian and Israeli colleagues who worked together to devise these disruptive technologies with farmers, and bringing together some of our colleagues from Thailand and Vietnam. So on the one hand, we have this sort of disruptive technologies that might bypass these large-scale infrastructures that come with all kinds of other associated political risks as well as technological risks. And also building on this approach of the Taiban researchers, how communities, citizens can be involved as monitors, as auditors of the resource, and how we can build networks of these social auditors across the sort of fault lines of political conflict, and to explore whether this can be a mechanism to understand each other's situation better and to try and resolve environmental crises, and then as a mechanism for addressing some of the deeper political conflicts as well. You see a list of the core partners involved in this effort. Okay, and the next one is a current project which is looking at challenges around equitable resilience in urban settings in Nepal and Thailand, and really trying to sort of explore how citizens can shape and influence these large kinds of investments that are framed and justified around building resilience, that often involve large physical infrastructure and reshaping of urban environments, and in many cases relocating people who are in some ways framed or constituted as being informal. And this project is led by Stockholm Environment Institute and my colleague John Enso and colleagues, academics, civil society colleagues in Nepal and Thailand, is really looking at sort of the politics of knowledge. How can informal settlers develop these kinds of tools and mechanisms that allow them to represent their interests and shift those sort of planning processes that I talked about earlier in relation to Suvarnabhumi International Airport. And particularly looking at this urban infrastructure and the way that it is shaped, designed, and implemented and managed. Okay, one more example, really looking at food systems, and this builds on a long-standing collaboration with Chiang Mai University in northern Thailand, and looking at food systems and their sort of inherent uncertainties and shocks. So this builds on several years collaboration, and we have the UN Food Systems Summit and preparatory work over the last few weeks. So this notion of food systems, I think, is really significant because I think it reflects much of how our world operates, that increasingly we're dependent on these global, interconnected, independent systems for food, for water, for energy, and today for communications. And that much of the shocks that we're going to see across the world, particularly with climate change, will be through how these through these systems, like food systems, are disrupted or become or actually fail. So you've got a little, sorry, you've got a little definition. This is from the UN Food Systems a summary introduction. Talks about what a food system is, and it includes all the sort of the different dimensions of food from production to consumption. And it also highlights the significance of when these systems, food systems in particular, when they fail, they have far-reaching cascading implications and impacts, and hugely disruptive. So what we're doing in this project is really focused on a northern part of Thailand, Mergem district in Chiang Mai province. And it's a story of how remote upland communities, largely ethnic communities, Karen people, have been increasingly incorporated into global food systems to produce animal feed corn as feed for chickens, for the poultry and the pigs that are then produced and exported all around the world, and certainly are consumed in the UK and I'm sure in other parts of the world where our participants are located. So increasingly you have this remote communities in the uplands of northern Thailand who are intimately linked into global food systems over which they have very little control, and in which they become consumers of the food systems to which they contribute. So what we're looking at in this project is how we can develop the sort of the tools for diagnosing the potential fragility and failure of these food systems, and to consider the severity, the criticality, the implications, and who might be impacted. And to do so in ways that generate and promote and allow different stakeholders, particularly those who are most vulnerable from crisis and collapse, to shape the food systems and create alternative food systems for the future. Okay, sorry, I feel I've been rushing a little bit, so I apologize if I've gone too quickly. So, just some final thoughts. And, you know, just before I came on to this talk, I was listening to the latest news from the British Met Office, and, you know, really highlighting that the climate change of the future has arrived in many ways. We are already in an era of extreme, unpredictable climate variability. And we know very clearly that despite the evidence that goes back 50 years, it's 1972, wasn't it, really, when we had these first global efforts, so 50 years of this effort, that we still haven't managed to shape significantly enough the future that is now unfolding. And that left to its own devices in the way that capital can target high-risk areas, we can see capital business opportunities steering us in ways that may not really be to our collective advantage. So I think we really have to think very carefully about what the role of knowledge, research, science is, to recognize that, as Norman Long, the sociologist, used to talk about development as being a battlefield of knowledge. And we are on that battlefield now. And that the way that we do our science, the way that we carry out our research, has to be done in recognition of the inherently political power dimensions of what counts as knowledge and how decisions are made and how we might be able to influence them. We also have to recognize that science, and this has been particularly true in the UK during the pandemic, the science and scientists have been very much under pressure, under political pressure. And we see again in the sort of the anti-vaccination campaigns and the spread of all kinds of ideas and conspiracy theories and social media that we're in a new age. That also poses challenges for more public science, because there is a public science, if you like. There's a whole body of research, in inverted commas, that goes on through trawling all kinds of information on social media and on the internet. So we have to have a sort of a public engagement that can bring these core principles of science, of evidence up, being held up to peer review and critical public scrutiny as part of this public process. And that we have to be much more engaged in seeing science not just as a matter of generating evidence, but also of creating ideas and arguments and creating this new public space.
Thank you very much, Richard. For our attendees, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to type them in the chat box anytime. And you can also use the raise hand function if you want to ask the question yourself. While waiting for the questions to come in, maybe I'll just have questions myself, if you don't mind, Richard. At the beginning of the webinar, I was thinking about how I can really translate the relevance of my research into practice. And what I learned from your presentation today is, I think to be able to do that, we have to first revisit the fundamental questions of our research. And your question, the question that you posed to us, whose knowledge counts? I think whatever research area we are working in, or whatever research topic we want to explore, I think that's a very important question that we have to start with whenever we have research endeavors or research initiatives. And thank you for that question, of which I will always keep in mind for my own research projects. And I also learned that to translate the relevance of my research into more effective policy and into practice, it's important to contextualize my research. And to do that, local collaboration and local engagement with the knowledge producers of the areas where I'm doing my research is actually very important. So those are the realizations that I have obtained from your presentation. So thank you for that. I have a question about the discourse and narrative about the trade-offs, and it's inevitable that we have this vulnerabilities that you've mentioned at the kind of the beginning of your presentation. I'm curious where this discourse or narrative is coming from. Definitely not from the scientists, for example, or the researchers. You mentioned about maybe the politics underpinning this big research questions. So are this discourses or these narratives coming from politicians only, or from the political landscape only, or they are also coming from other sectors? Another question I want to ask you is about why high-risk areas are very attractive to capital, which is quite enlightening for me, because at NERPS, you are also doing a project on hydropower plants actually in Nepal, in Koshi Barrage in the south, and in Salmadam in Afghanistan. So we want to find out the relationship between how the peace and sustainability are being manifested at the local communities. And we are really working hard to engage with the local communities in those areas, not just to get to get the knowledge from them, but also to really work with them on addressing these issues. Do you think there will be a danger when we collaborate with, say, local partners, local communities? There will be a danger of passing on the responsibility to them because of, say, building on their capacity or equipping them with certain skills, for example, and tools, providing them with certain technologies. Of course, that is empowering in the end, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are about the potential danger of passing on the responsibilities of addressing these global issues to local communities. Those are two questions from me. So you can answer those questions now while waiting for the questions from the participants. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for two enormously challenging questions. Let me try and deal with the first. Where do these discourses come from? I think that's that in itself is a really interesting sort of research question, to try and understand where these sort of enduring ideas come from, and how different, as you kind of were talking about, how different agendas can sometimes accidentally coalesce around similar narratives. So I think, the idea of hydropowers driving economic progress in the Mekong dates back to the late 50s, early 60s through the US involvement in the region. And we know how that ended out. and, you know, a sort of an era that was where economic development was really anchored in technological progress and large-scale infrastructure, and how this large-scale infrastructure was also a symbol, a testament of state power and state authority and state legitimacy. So the dams you see on the Mekong, the mainstream dams in the lower Mekong, the locations were pretty much identified at that period. So these are old technologies designed in an old, you know, a distant past in some ways. Some of the costs, perhaps not the scale, but the impacts on fisheries were recognized. So they were sort of revitalized as the region came out of conflict in the late 90s. And I think, so part of these discourses come from these models, these ideas of what development is and what progress is. And these kinds of narratives are more easily maintained when the voices of the people who are likely to be impacted are excluded. So as these plans were being developed, there was no effective mechanism or effort to really bring in any meaningful way the people who are likely to be impacted. And I think if you look at the sort of the history of dams and the work of the World Commission on Dams, that we see this happens quite a lot. But I think there's another element to this, where we in the environment, sustainability, development sort of lobby have also miscalculated, that we have often engaged in this hydropower debate in the Mekong by highlighting the impacts, talking about fisheries will be impacted, people will be impacted. And, you know, we can end up constructing leading to an argument that we hadn't quite imagined. So, for example, we argued for a long time that poor people are dependent on fisheries and they'll be impacted by the hydropower development. But there's a counter argument to that and say, well, people are poor because they depend on fisheries. If they didn't depend on fisheries, if they did something else, if they worked in factories, if they had other kinds of income opportunities, then it wouldn't matter. So I think it's a really tricky story of how different ideas and different ways of framing arguments can lead us into uncomfortable places and uncomfortable positions. And I think too much from the sort of, particularly around infrastructure, we've talked about impacts rather than seeing fisheries as drivers of development, natural fisheries, small-scale agriculture as being in a key, as a desirable outcome of good development, not as a cost to be calculated and mitigated against. So we've kind of inadvertently slipped into the kinds of arguments that it's now very difficult to extricate ourselves from. And this question about, you know, responsibility and risk, that is a very challenging question. And, you know, we have to recognize that the political forces that are behind these investments and what we're up against. And, you know, there are many cases from all around the world of environmental human rights defenders speaking up against hydropower, for example, and being disappeared or murdered or intimidated. So it is a really murky and dangerous arena. But I think, you know, it's difficult to give a sort of a quick answer to this, but I think one thing that we do need to recognize is that if our intention is to influence policy, then we need to understand what policy is and how it works, and not assume that it works the way that we would like it to work. And if we recognize that policy is driven by these sort of political forces, political processes, then we have to think how we can navigate and exert some influence on those forces. Sorry, that's a very weak answer to a very challenging, complex question.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry for that quite big question, which also kind of bothering me for some time. So thank you for your thoughts on that. I saw a hand raised by Holger Hoffman. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Right, okay, thank you. You are now allowed to talk, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Holger Hoffman here, Hiroshima University. Now, I'm more from the physics side here, actually. So I was thinking all the time, I'm very concerned about a lot of things that you were saying, but I think I almost see it a little bit more from, I might say, the opposite side of the issue. And we have a lot of specialization. So almost everybody who works on a project is getting into it from the specialized side of the engineer or the technical scientist, right? And I do believe that too much of the policy is really shaped by the desires of politicians to make use of that in the most convenient way. So the question is, I mean, how do you avoid this trap that science and engineering especially just serves this kind of promise maker where easy technical solutions are requested? I mean, I think that is the tendency now, especially with the internet and AI and so on, right? So maybe you could comment a little bit on this problem, how to deal with these proposals that try to make the world a better place by changing the way we live in a very fundamental way, but actually just changing it in terms of the technologies we use. Another
Huge question that I don't really feel qualified to answer completely, but I think it really is a fundamental question, because I mean, part of the problem that you're talking about is that the solution to the kinds of problems we're faced is being framed simply as a technological solution. I think that is something we do need to challenge. Obviously, technology has huge potential to address many of our challenges. But as you say, technology doesn't exist in isolation. Technology is part of wider social, cultural, environmental worlds that we live in. And we have to see it accordingly. And I think, you know, part of the framing of the kinds of problems we face allows for these rather mechanistic kinds of responses that really privilege technological solutions above all else. And certainly one of the areas that we're colleagues and I at York and elsewhere are very interested in is these commitments to a sort of a new green kind of economy, new energy transitions, food transitions, to really think about where the benefits and costs might lie and how they might be distributed. And it's very clear from some of the technological innovations around alternative energy forms is that they don't necessarily deliver the kinds of social benefits or environmental benefits that we would expect. They don't necessarily create the jobs, the high quality, secure jobs that we might expect. They may depend on labor in other parts of the world to produce for energy benefits in the UK, for example. So I think, you know, part of the challenge that we face is understanding technology more as putting technology in this sort of social, ecological, technological framing and recognizing the interdependencies and interconnections between them. But I think you also highlight that I'm certainly not arguing against the importance and value of scientific expertise. And I think that itself is dangerous, and we need to be careful sometimes that we romanticize alternative knowledges to a dangerous point where we completely undermine the value of expertise. And there needs to be some mechanism between the two. And I think for me that is partly about recognizing science, knowledge, expertise in the sort of broader social context.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, there's one comment maybe I was thinking of that. I actually think it's hugely important that experts also recognize that they are part of the whole system. And I don't think we have enough actually consciousness in the education for engineering that would tell people that they play a role in society. That's actually quite important, that the expertise they have is something others rely on, and therefore it must be used in a context in the right way. So I think we should really work harder on emphasizing that because it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of interesting work around what is sometimes called responsible research innovation that looks at how you can sort of build in these core principles of research as a sort of social process, and to ensure that we do what we do appropriately and ethically.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Holger, and thank you, Richard, for that answer. We received a question during the registration from a university student from Japan. And the question is about the consistency in terms of bringing sustainability or peace in society. This is a little bit broad question, but I think we can anchor this question on the topic for today on policy and the link of policy and research. I think how can we maintain consistency in terms of collaboration between policy and practice when we want to achieve, say, various goals related to peace, sustainability and peace. Maybe I can also contextualize the question. You mentioned about how climate change, climate action, for example, started way back 1972, and until now, we still have a lot of things to move forward to. How can we probably ensure that what we have started earlier could be maintained and sustained in the long run? If you have worked with researchers in Thailand, for example, and in Vietnam, did you find, can you explain some examples of maintaining that sustained partnership with academics there, researchers there, as well as non-academic sector in your own research projects? I hope I was able to contextualize it. It's a little bit broad.
Go around the question a little bit. I think, and maybe this speaks to what Holger raised as well. Just one point. Many years ago, going back to the fisheries issues, I was involved in some work. There were a number of projects that aimed to stated they were going to influence policy. And so we did a little bit of an assessment, just went around and asked them, so what policy are you targeting? How is that policy made? How are you going to engage? How are you going to influence? And surprisingly, none of the projects with a stated aim to influence policy had actually sat down and worked out how. It was assumed. And I think we're often guilty of that. And you know, this itself is a research question. How do we influence policy? And we need to recognize it's very, very complex. It's very murky. It's very difficult. I think, you know, in my own career, I have to pay tribute to my Thai colleagues because when I did my PhD, I really lost faith in academia. That I couldn't really see how the research would have any impact at all. And it was really from learning how Thai academic colleagues operate and how they see themselves as public intellectuals, and that their major function is to be convening, facilitating dialogue, to be engaging. And I think this is you know, it's easy to say this, and I think, you know, it's really inspirational. They put themselves out, they take very high personal risks and very difficult political circumstances, and very, you know, all kinds of different challenges. And I would say, again, and this is not my work, this is, you know, this is work that local people have led with Thai colleagues, that Taiban kind of example, it's been going for 20 years. There's no, can't say that they've changed the world, but they've had influence in certain cases, particularly strong, in others, you know, up against insurmountable forces. But I think that whole engagement was very carefully strategized from a very clear, nuanced understanding of politics and knowledge, and they've done very well at sustaining.
Thank you, Richard. That's quite encouraging for some of us who are maybe a little bit disillusioned with finding it difficult to translating our research into more socially relevant outcomes. And maybe the first step to that is actually finding ways on how to make our research outputs more accessible to policymakers, maybe producing knowledge beyond publications in journals, for example, and making them more accessible to policymakers. Thank you for that answer. We are now, actually, this is very great timing. We only have 1 minute left. If you have any final remarks, Richard, before I close the webinar.
Well, obviously I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. I'm very honored to have been able to present today. I apologize if it's wandered a little bit, but I think, maybe there's a core message about how we think what the research process should be about. And, we ourselves operate in certain institutional contexts that push us to do certain things, to get papers out, even if people don't read those papers. And, we also have to be creative and think about how our research can be much more open to other people to engage in, and how research can support other voices to represent their own evidence, their own arguments. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for sharing with us today the importance of collaboration between research and practice when it comes to addressing environmental conflict, and the different considerations that we need to take into account to make our research-informed policies truly effective. And to our attendees, thank you for your time and participation today. And we hope to see you again in our future events. You can learn more about our upcoming webinars and other events, including the NERPS conference that Professor Kaneko mentioned earlier, through our website, www.nerps.org. And you can also follow our updates through our social media accounts. So thank you so much again. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody. Take care, stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.